Week 5 of the NFL season is officially here, so in today's video, let's go ahead and predict every single game of week number 5. So as I said, we are going to be talking about week number 5 and trying to predict every single game. Unfortunately, we do have 4 bye weeks this week, and those teams are going to be the Philadelphia Eagles, the LA Chargers, the Detroit Lions, and the Tennessee Titans. So to those 4 teams, hopefully they get healthy and can come back stronger next week. With that all said, we are going to begin with our Thursday night football game and end it off with our Monday night football game. And if you guys do go on to enjoy today's video, hit the like and subscribe button, but let's get into it. So as I said, we are going to begin with our Thursday night football game between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons. This should be a very interesting game with one team that hasn't really looked all that strong in the Atlanta Falcons going up against a Buccaneers team that has looked really good, but also had a really bad game against Denver, so it's a little bit to be determined about what team we're going to see tonight from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Atlanta is currently 2-2, and both of their wins against Philadelphia and New Orleans were, I don't want to say fluky, but definitely not completely earned, if that makes sense. Against the Philadelphia Eagles, they're one Saquon Barkley catch away from essentially losing that one. And if you watch the Saints game, they had a couple pretty nice breaks to help them get that victory over New Orleans. So while I'm not going to sit up here and tell you guys that Atlanta is a bad team or a fraud, because I don't think they are. I think they are a good team. I also do think they still have a lot of things that they need to work out. So because of that, I am going to lean towards the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to win this game. I think Tampa Bay has put together some really solid games. Even though they did lose to Denver, I do believe that one was maybe just a tad bit fluky. So I'm going to predict the final score to be 27 Tampa Bay to the 21 of Atlanta Falcons. Next up, we have our 8:30 game between the Minnesota Vikings and the New York Jets. I believe this game is being played in London, so that should potentially add a little bit of drama to this game. Ultimately, you have one team that is completely on a tear in the Minnesota Vikings going up against a Jets team that's really trying to figure out who they really are. The Jets have had some really good moments, but have also had a couple just big-time duds. That San Francisco game in week 1 was a big-time dud, and then this past week against the Denver Broncos, one of the worst games I've ever seen from Aaron Rodgers. And now you're going up against a Brian Flores-led defense that is definitely going to give some issues to that Jets offense. Now, I don't think that defense is necessarily going to trick Aaron Rodgers and give a bunch of turnovers or anything like that. But everything that I've seen from this defense is they're really playing some really clean and sound football, and they're doing a really good job of disguising coverages. So I do think that could definitely give some issues to even a veteran quarterback like Rodgers. Whereas for Minnesota, I don't expect this game to be terribly high scoring. I expect Minnesota to be able to move the ball occasionally down the field, but it could be drives that are a tad bit hit or miss. But ultimately, I'm going to go ahead and kind of stick to the rhythm of what the season has shown me thus far, which is that Minnesota is probably the best team in the NFL, at least as of week 5. So I'm going to pick Minnesota to win this game 24 to the New York Jets 16. Then we have our noon games between the Carolina Panthers and the Chicago Bears. This game should be actually quite interesting because Carolina actually has looked like a competent team these past 2 weeks. Whereas Chicago is kind of struggling offensively, but getting better slowly but surely. Chicago is obviously known for their defense, so I do expect their defense to play at a very high level. I expect this game to have a couple turnovers, probably some sloppy football, probably not a bunch of really good running games. I don't expect DeAndre Swift nor Chuba Hubbard to really be able to get going. So ultimately, I kind of expect this game to come down to which quarterback can put together a drive in the fourth quarter or maybe the third quarter to give their team an edge. And from what I've seen from Caleb, I just don't know if he's capable of doing that, at least right now. Whereas for somebody like Andy Dalton, who's been in these situations for over 10 years of his career, I definitely do think he could manage to put off a couple of drives that give his team an advantage. Now, I will say Carolina's defense is no match to Chicago's defense. I think that's a bit not even really close competition. Chicago has a fantastic defense. Carolina doesn't. So I don't expect this one to be necessarily extremely high scoring. Again, I think the defenses will play well. I am going to give this one to Carolina, though, and I think Andy Dalton could be able to do a couple of things that give his team an advantage, whereas Caleb Williams is still kind of trying to figure things out. This one is maybe a tad bit of an upset pick on my end. Moving on to the Washington Commanders versus the Cleveland Browns. Kind of similar story here to a couple of the teams we talked about. You have a Washington team that is absolutely on fire going up against a Cleveland Browns team that just simply cannot do nothing right. The Browns do have a good defense, and I will say I do think Deshaun Watson has started to play better football, but they're still a team that is extremely flawed, and as long as Deshaun Watson isn't playing great, they're a team that I really worry about. Whereas for Washington, they clearly have a recipe for success. Yes, this defense isn't very good, but they clearly have the offense that can overcome some of their defensive issues. So with that being said, I do expect this game to be sort of a back and forth game, maybe a low scoring first half, but I think once Jaden Daniels sort of gets comfortable in this game, can figure out what's going on with the defense, I do expect him to be able to put together a bunch of really solid drives in that second half. Whereas for Cleveland, I just don't think offensively, even if you're going up against a bad defense, that they have the offensive personnel to really match up against Jaden Daniels and that really good offense that Washington is putting together. So because of that, I think ultimately this could be a game where Washington just simply outscores a team like Cleveland. So with that all said, I'm going to predict the Washington Commanders to win 30 to the Cleveland Browns 20. Moving on to a game that should be maybe the worst game of the week between the New England Patriots and the Miami Dolphins. With the Miami Dolphins having question marks at the quarterback position and the New England Patriots having really no passing game and some really bad offensive lineman play, this game is more than likely going to be a little bit ugly. But I will say, I think an ugly game as of right now would favor a team like the New England Patriots, who have sort of built their identity around running the football, and if they can run the football, they're going to be more successful. And while I don't think they're going to be able to be extremely successful running the football against Miami, I do think that they're going to be able to continue to press the issue, continue to hand the ball off, and eventually they'll get some big chunk plays. Whereas for this Miami offense, I just don't really know where you're going to get your offensive production from. Yes, you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and some really good running backs, but when you have a quarterback who just isn't comfortable in the system, it's going to be very difficult to really hand the ball out to your playmakers. And unfortunately, their head coach, Mike McDaniel, hasn't really put together a game plan that would favor a guy like Tyler Huntley or Skylar Thompson, whoever may be the starting quarterback. So because of that, I do think New England's defense will be able to play some good football, will be able to score enough points, and I think they'll get the job done. So I have the final score being 17 New England to 13 for the Miami Dolphins. Moving on, we have an AFC South divisional clash between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Indianapolis Colts. Indianapolis, from what I know, is not going to be playing. He sounds like he is day to day, but if I had to assume, because they're going up against a bad opponent, they'll probably just sit Anthony for a week and give Joe Flacco the starting job. I will give 2 picks for this one, though. I'm going to go with what would the game be, what would the score be, or who do I think will win if Joe Flacco is the starting quarterback, and I'll give another answer for if Anthony Richardson is the starting quarterback, because as of right now, we just don't have an answer as to who will be the starting quarterback. So if Anthony is healthy, I do think this offense can definitely take advantage of using his legs, even if they don't do it as much because of his injury, they still will definitely utilize it. I also think with Anthony, you can easily run RPOs at a more successful rate. You can also use Jonathan Taylor as a more serious weapon because of Anthony's ability to run with the football. Anthony also just has those game-breaking plays where he can just throw the ball 50 yards down the field and make a big splash play. With that said, Anthony has also struggled with turnovers, so I would expect there to be a couple turnovers that would give Jacksonville some extra opportunities to put up some points. So with that all said, I am going to pick, if Anthony is playing, the Indianapolis Colts to beat the Jacksonville Jaguars with the final score of something like 24-21 or something along those lines. Whereas if Joe Flacco is playing, even though I think Flacco is a really good and quality quarterback, I also do think that he kind of ruins what makes this offense for Indianapolis kind of work, which is that immediate threat of having a rushing quarterback. If you're Jacksonville, if you're going up against Joe Flacco, you can really just hone in on the run. And even though Joe Flacco might be, at this point in his career, a better thrower of the football than Anthony, I don't really know if that favors this Colts team. Now, with that all said, I could be completely wrong, but I am actually going to say if Joe Flacco plays, that the Jaguars get their first win of the season with a final score of 27-21. If Anthony does play, I think they'll win. If they don't have him playing, if they have Joe Flacco playing, I think they'll lose. Then we have the Buffalo Bills going up against the Houston Texans. This game should be absolutely electric. These are two really good Super Bowl contending AFC teams, and I think this one is going to come down to the wire. Ultimately speaking, though, I'm going to pick a team that I think has looked better so far this season. Obviously, both teams are 3-1, and both teams have at least one blowout loss. But from what I've seen from Buffalo, they've just looked a tad bit more clean on both sides of the football, whereas this Texans team hasn't quite gotten their stride going 100%. For Buffalo, you obviously have, in my opinion, maybe the second or third guy who should probably be winning the MVP. I would say Darnold is probably number one right now, which is crazy to say. But their offense is really clicking. I know it wasn't clicking versus Baltimore, but for the most part of the season, the offense has been really clicking. They have a run game, they have some receiving threats that can do a variety of things, and the defense was playing some good football. Whereas for Houston, they're obviously winning games, but they're not winning in a fashion that I think is really all that sexy, I guess you could say. These games feel like methodical, move the ball down the field, really slow paced. And while Stroud is, of course, making some big time plays, they haven't really had a victory so far this year that I feel like seriously impressed me. And when you lose to Minnesota, who was probably the toughest team on your schedule, I kind of feel like that was a chance for you to prove yourself, but you haven't passed it yet. Of course, I do think Houston is a really good team and they could easily win this game. Again, they are a Super Bowl contender in my books. But I am going to give this slight advantage to the Buffalo Bills. I think the Bills could win this one, maybe on a game-winning drive, which would be absolutely awesome. So I'm going to pick the final score to be 31 Buffalo to 28 of the Houston Texans. And then we have an AFC North divisional matchup between the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals. This is a Bengals team that, quite frankly, almost has to win this game, because if you go down to 1-4, that's going to be an absolute huge hill to climb, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to come back from that. Whereas for Baltimore, you've figured out your offense. Your offense really runs through Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson, and if they can build off that identity, that's going to be a scary combination for the rest of the season. And when doing research for this game, I believe that Lamar Jackson is like 5-1 against Joe Burrow with only one loss on his resume versus Joe. So that doesn't obviously bode well for Joe Burrow. And then you also look at which team has been playing better this season. And yes, Baltimore had that embarrassing loss to Las Vegas, but they honestly could have beaten Kansas City in week 1. They had a week 3 victory versus the Dallas Cowboys, and they dominated the Buffalo Bills. Whereas for Cincinnati, you've lost 3 straight, and then you beat the Carolina Panthers by like 1 score. So obviously, I feel like this game really does heavily lean towards Baltimore. Now, granted, Cincinnati could make this a game and could make this one very interesting because they are talented. They do have a good offense, they do have a good quarterback, and they do have a good defense. But Baltimore right now, in my opinion, is on a trajectory that makes them a better team than Cincinnati. So with that said, I am going to pick Baltimore to continue to beat the Cincinnati Bengals. I have Baltimore winning with a final score of 28-24. And then we enter into our 3 o'clock window, going up with the Denver Broncos versus the Las Vegas Raiders, a AFC West matchup, and I expect this one to be fairly low scoring. Both of these teams have some good defenses, but offensively, they're very limited. And with the Raiders likely not having Devontae Adams because of the Devontae Adams trade rumors, that definitely doesn't help the case for the Las Vegas Raiders. Las Vegas cannot run the football, and Denver's defense is really good against the pass. I just feel like that's going to be a recipe for disaster for this Raiders team. Now, I do think this one will be extremely close because as of right now, Bo Nix hasn't really looked like a quarterback that can drop 30 points on a team. Maybe he'll get there, maybe not, but as of right now, he isn't there. And with Las Vegas having questions at the quarterback position, having questions in the receiving core, and a couple of defensive issues too, I can definitely see this being a game where Las Vegas is extremely outmatched. So because of that, and because I believe in Sean Payton and what Bo Nix are doing, hell, they just beat the freaking New York Jets, I'm going to go with the Denver Broncos to win this game with a final score of 17-14. Then we have another divisional matchup here between the San Francisco 49ers going up against the Arizona Cardinals. I do expect this game to be extremely high scoring. Both these offenses are really good, and both these defenses haven't quite yet figured out what they want to be. Arizona's defense just doesn't simply have the talent, and they also just don't really have an identity right now. Whereas for San Francisco, they have the talent, but they're just not playing really good ball right now. So because of that, I do think both these quarterbacks will be able to find a lot of success. This should be a game where the receiving cores are able to find plenty of opportunities to put up some big time yardage. I kind of feel like this might be a game where players can fill up the stat sheet and really look a lot better on their resume. Guys like Brandon Ayuk, who haven't played well, easily could have a big breakout game here. So I am going to pick the Niners to win this one. They're just simply the more talented and better team than the Kyler Murray-led Arizona Cardinals. I have the final score being San Francisco 38 to the Arizona Cardinals 21. Next up, we have an NFC showdown between the Seattle Seahawks and the New York Giants. Seattle is coming off a pretty good loss against the Detroit Lions. Obviously, Detroit is just the better team right now, but there really is no shame in that loss. They played a pretty good ball game. Whereas for the Giants, you've had 10 days of rest coming off your Thursday night matchup versus the Cowboys. I'm not sure 100% what the status is of Malik Neighbors. So I do think that definitely does give Seattle a better chance to win this game. I'll say this, if Malik Neighbors does play, it doesn't change my opinion of this game. It just might change the score a tad bit. Malik Neighbors is just simply a different breed of wide receiver. He can make plays with his legs. He can make plays over the top. I mean, he's just a difference maker. So if he does play, I do think the final score is a little bit closer, but I don't think it ultimately changes my opinion. Ultimately speaking, this is just a Seattle team that is just clearly better. Yes, the Seattle Seahawks have played around with some of these bad teams like New England, but ultimately, this is a team that is extremely competitive. I think they have an extremely underrated quarterback in Geno Smith. DK Metcalf is playing good football, and the defense is still having some issues, but they still have the talent to outmatch a team like New York. So for the New York Giants, I do think you're going to lose, but if Neighbors does play, I think the game is a little bit closer. Because of that, I'm going to give the final score 28-14 in favor of Seattle, but if Malik Neighbors does play, it could be more like 28-21, 28-17, something along those lines. Then we have our last 3 o'clock game between the Green Bay Packers and the struggling LA Rams. The Rams are completely injured and banged up right now and just not playing good football, whereas the Packers are coming off a respectable loss against the Minnesota Vikings where they had a really rough first half and then started to play really good football in that second half. And I expect this one to be a much better performance from Jordan Love. He looked really shaky early on versus the Vikings before he found his rhythm and started to play some good ball. So because of that, I think he's going to carry that over against an LA Rams defense that is just not good at stopping the run and isn't very good against the pass either. So I expect Jordan Love and that Packers offense to be able to put up some numbers. So it's really going to come down to, can Matthew Stafford and that offense muster up enough points to overcome a Packers offense that I do expect to be able to methodically and consistently move the ball down the field. And because right now this Rams offense just doesn't have the playmakers or the team in general to do that, I think this Packers team is going to win this one pretty handily. I think Green Bay, again, should be able to put up some easy yardage, should put up some easy points, whereas this Rams team is going to have to work for everything. But I'm going to have the final score as 31 Green Bay to 20 for the LA Rams. Then we have our Sunday night football game going up against the Dallas Cowboys and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh is kind of just rolling around here. They've been playing some good football at times, but they are coming off their first loss of the season. Whereas for the Dallas Cowboys, you haven't played a game in 10 days, but you are extremely banged up. DeMarcus Lawrence is not going to be playing. Micah Parsons won't be playing. Deron Bland is still injured. And potentially there's also an injury to Kalen Carson and Brandon Cooks. So if that's the case, that is about 5 or maybe even more starters that aren't going to be playing against a Pittsburgh team that has their identity figured out. This is a Pittsburgh team that wants to run the football. They want to use Justin Fields, Najee Harris, and Jalen Warren and all these guys, and they're going to use George Pickens to make your big plays down the field. And because Dallas just doesn't have the personnel anymore on their defensive line and on their defense, I don't see a world where they can even physically stop this Steelers offense from just running the football every single down. Now, I don't expect this one to be a very high scoring game, but what I do expect is I expect Pittsburgh to just go on extremely long 5 to 8 minute drives, whereas Dallas is going to have to find ways to score points in a small amount of time. And so because of that, I don't think Dallas is really going to be able to find a rhythm offensively, whereas I feel like for Pittsburgh, because they can just easily run the football on this really bad Dallas Cowboys defensive line, I feel like that's just really going to give a huge edge to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think they'll dominate time of possession. I think they'll dominate the trenches. And I think that's a recipe for success for Pittsburgh and a recipe for disaster for the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously, I think Dak Prescott will give this team some sparks. Will be able to move the ball down the field. But when you don't have your number 2 option, your tight end is already dealing with injuries, you have a young offensive line going up against TJ Watt, and your defense probably won't be able to stop the run game, I don't really feel like Dallas has much of a chance in this game. So because of that, I'm going to go Pittsburgh 24 to the Dallas Cowboys 19. And lastly, we have a Monday Night Football matchup between the New Orleans Saints, who are coming off a loss, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who are currently 4-0. The Saints obviously looked incredible in weeks 1 and 2, but have kind of fallen back down to earth the past 2 weeks. I think they're clearly still a better team than what they were last year, but I feel like we're starting to see a little bit more of the true colors of who the Saints are after they've went up against some better teams than Dallas and Carolina. Whereas for Kansas City, they're dealing with a couple injuries. Obviously, the big one in recent news has been Rashee Rice, but this is still a Chiefs team that has a fantastic defense, can still run the football, and still has Patrick Mahomes. So while I do feel like this one is going to be a very close and competitive game, and I do feel like this Saints defense will find a bunch of success against Patrick Mahomes and that offense, because this offense right now isn't quite clicking unless Travis Kelce can, put a time machine out there and play good football again. But I feel like this one could easily be more of a defensive showdown that maybe at some point could potentially turn into a bit of a shootout. And what I mean by that is I think the first half is going to be really low scoring. I'm talking like 10-3, 10-7 type of score. And then late in that fourth, maybe towards the back end of the third, in the fourth quarter, you're going to start to see these offenses really start to get going and start putting up some numbers. So with all that said, that's just kind of what I think could happen. I'm going to pick Kansas City to win this one. They're just clearly the better team in my personal opinion. They have the better quarterback, the better defense, the better offensive line. And I think New Orleans is, again, a better team than what they were last year, but they're still not a complete team. I still feel like they have a couple issues. So because of that, I'm going to pick Kansas City to win with a final score of 24-21. But it's going to conclude all of my picks for the video. This right here are all the picks, just to kind of highlight what I did here. As you can see, my current record for all my picks is 36-28. Not the greatest record, but we're definitely hoping to kind of improve that one with this week's picks. But if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.